Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress. Um, so I spent all last week writing this report and the line by line and do all the writing about the custody evaluations. There were three custody evaluations in this one. There was one with the original evaluator. Then there was one for the opposing parent, hired their own evaluation. So we had two custody evaluations. And then the first one did a update evaluation. So I had three custody evaluations on this. Holy cow. None of them, all of them were awful. The two psychologists involved were just awful. But I wrote my report for that last week and took yesterday off. This is Saturday. I just finished all the report writing, and I need to clear my head for the next group. I have three more in the wings. Um, but I went out and heard some live music last night, so I'm a little sleepy. This morning's coffee with Dr. Childress is a wake up coffee, as opposed to just a gathering together. Let me tell you a little bit about these Facebook Lives and also the other videos that I put up, the fireside chats at this point. Is I'm doing something with that, and not only am I educating parents, but there's two other aspects of that. Is uh, I'm an internet psychologist, and what I realize is that the whole methodology of professional conferences is actually a dead thing because I can get on the internet and give you an hour seminar. And so, why would I need to go to some conference somewhere to present a seminar to a limited scope of people when I can just hop on the internet and give you a seminar from Dr. Childress weekly? And so, the whole idea of professional conferences, I call it thinking flatlander. It's a dead approach, but the brains of the past don't understand what's happening with the internet and what the available options are regarding professional development, those sorts of things. The idea of journals, it used to be I go into the stack of library or the library stacks at UCLA and have to pull out volumes of books and take them over to the copy machine to get a journal article. And so I had rows and rows of Xeroxed journal articles in my office, big binders of them around ADHD, autism, those sorts of things. But now, I can get stuff on the internet, and the publications are moving more and more over to the internet because they're being funded by the public, but the information that gets developed from public funding, typically grants and things, is private. Nobody has access to it. So there's a big controversy. And I think ultimately there's going to be wide scale access to published journal articles on the internet, which kills journal publications. The Just by the way, on journal publications, the whole idea of peer reviewed, you hear that a lot. That's for research. Okay. That's the peer review of whether the research methodology was accurate and proper. There's no peer review of opinions. There kind of is something like the American Journal of Family Therapy. Its editorial board is the Gardnerian PAS experts, and so they just publish their own stuff, and it's peer reviewed by them. But it's awful. It's just has no basis in scientific value or the scientific established knowledge. They just make stuff up, but they make it up all together, and so it's a peer reviewed journal, and it's just stupid. They've had peer reviewed articles on parental alienation syndrome. There's no such thing for 40 years. And so what? Nobody believes it. And so the idea of peer review is developed by the pathogen relative to Gardner's model because he came up with new proposals for pathology. And they said, there's no evidence of that. There's no research for what you're saying about this parental alienation you're developing. Plus, it's an absolutely awful diagnostic model. So not only is there no research evidence, it's just an absolutely awful model for a pathology. And that was valid to Gardner because he's just making stuff up and there's no research about that. And they put peer reviewed on that for peer reviewed research. It's about research. Um, but then, so the idea of peer review is ridiculous in journals. Journals, I think, are going to be transforming. The whole issue of conferences, I think, is going to be transforming. I have no interest in going and presenting to conferences to little groups of people. What that is it actually kind of puffs up your vita a little bit. A lot of early entry psychologists will go and present at various conferences. The big ones are the APA conference or the regional APA conferences, Western Psych Association, Rocky Mountain Psych Association, all these various psych associations, California psychology. Um, it would be, the state psychology organizations would be the third level down of presentations, and the early folks, the early career professionals will attend those or present at those. Graduate students will present at those to kind of bolster their vita as they apply for jobs. But this is a seminar from Dr. Childress. I can do this every Sunday, give you a seminar. Today's seminar is going to be Piggies at the Trough of your bank account. Oh my goodness, you folks fund so many people. It's stunning to me how the system believes that you can afford just all these extraneous people, and you pay for them, and you support their careers. You send their kids to college, and you buy their cars and house payments. But they do nothing for you. They solve absolutely nothing. But they keep adding on all these expenses to you until your bank account runs dry, and then you have to go pro se, and you lose your attorney, and then all the mental health people and everybody goes away, and all these piggies go away and abandon you to the pathology because you can't afford to pay them anymore. So they're really just over here to exploit you. That's just the nature of what's happening over in the family courts. You parents, you have to get mental health involvement because the court cannot diagnose what the pathology is. They're legal professionals, so they turn to psychology for the diagnosis, and then the psychologists completely fail the courts and fail you and fail your child, and return no diagnosis typically, um, and sometimes inaccurate or misdiagnosis, and we'll talk about that because they're ignorant and incompetent, and so they solve nothing, and yet they take all your money. And you want proof that they solve nothing? Forensic psychology and this whole approach and all these parenting coordinators and GALs and all the piggies at your trough have been here for 40 years, since the 1980s when the clinical psychologists left and we gave you over to the forensic people. So we've been here for 40 years, the forensic people have, and they have solved nothing. We're still in the same difficulty. You're still running into the same pathology and the same problem, and nothing is solved after 40 years. I'll cite to the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations. They're just awful. And after 40 years of failure, what makes you think another 20 years of failure is going to change anything? And it's not. We need to end this experiment of forensic psychology, and it is an experiment. They experimented on you by giving you your own special psychologists who do something different than clinical psychology. And I'll cite over to Simon and Stahl, but they do this forensic mindset rather than a clinical mindset, and they make an argument for that. Um, they make it forcefully that the forensic psychology is better than clinical psychology. No, it's an experiment. They experiment on you for 40 years. It was an absolute failure, destroyed thousands and thousands of children's lives and parents' lives in the process of their experiment on you, in this new field of forensic psychology that solved absolutely nothing. colluded with the child abuse over here, and it needs to end this experiment. One of the arguments I would make I am making right now to any professional who listens to this is that entire period of time. If you're doing an experiment on somebody, I've worked research. If you're doing, you have to explain what the alternatives are to your experiment on them. So the alternative to a forensic custody evaluation is a clinical diagnostic assessment. But they never told parents that they could get a clinical diagnostic assessment in as opposed to a forensic assessment. They withheld that information. They only gave parents this experimental new approach, and that was just massively unethical and massively problematic as a professional practice to come up with an experiment and not inform parents or the court that there are alternatives to your 20 to 40,000 6-month forensic evaluation. The alternative is a clinical diagnostic assessment. I can probably bring that in about $5,000 with a second opinion on it, 2,500 without a second opinion, but then everybody fights about it. But as opposed to $20,000 to $40,000, a clinical diagnostic assessment can be returned in 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks, which is appropriate to assessing possible child abuse or possible spousal abuse. We want to get on that quickly. And instead, they do a forensic evaluation 4 to 6 months when the possible diagnosis is child abuse. That's too long. And it doesn't return to diagnosis. So it's just a nightmare. So today, I want to talk to you about all the piggies, the parents. Oh, before I leave the issue of seminars on, the other reason I'm doing this is any mental health professional can come and watch these, but none of them are, which highlights that none of them are motivated to learn what they're doing. Because I can guarantee you that none of the professionals in the family courts are competent in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders. Not a one of them. I know that because the only place you acquire knowledge for the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders is over in schizophrenia. And so I know that they don't have that background. I have that background. I worked schizophrenia, so I know how to diagnose delusional thought disorders. But none of the mental health people in the family courts do. I know that for a fact. Plus, I know none of them know about the attachment system and attachment pathology, because the only place attachment pathology shows up is early childhood. That's when the attachment system forms. The people who know the attachment system and attachment pathology and how to fix it are in early childhood mental health, 0 to 5. And that's a subspecialty. I have that subspecialty, but I know for a fact they don't. So I've got it's an attachment pathology, and they don't know the attachment system. I know that for a fact. It's a delusional thought disorder. They don't know how to assess for delusional thought disorders. I know that for a fact. So I know for a fact they're incompetent. And yet they're supposed to be consulting. They're supposed to be standard 2.03 maintaining competence for all the psychologists. They're supposed to be taking responsibility for, but none of them are on my Facebook page. None of them are asking me questions on my Facebook page. That would be so easy for a psychologist to come over to my Facebook page and ask me a consulting question. Dr. Childress, I have a case like this. What would you recommend? And that would be available to all parents to hear the dialogue and the discussion. They don't have to give me specific information about the family, just general information. And I could answer their general question to the benefit of all parents out there, to the benefit of any mental health professional who's out there who also is listening to Dr. Childress. But none of them are motivated to learn what they're doing. And so that's what these videos right now are designed to document. Two things. It's designed to give you information. It's designed, I'm giving seminars, and I think that's valuable. I can give an hour seminar every week. And then it's to document that the current crop of mental health professionals have zero motivation to solve anything, zero motivation to be competent, zero motivation to be ethical. And so when eventually the APA gets over here, because it's going to be such a nightmare in the family courts regarding professional psychology, once the forensic psychologists fail, once the experiment is acknowledged as a failure, and it is right now, Blue Ribbon Commission from New York, and that's going to become more and more evident that this experiment in forensic psychology is a complete failure, then there's going to be no mental health services in the family courts. There never really was, but it'll be obvious. The forensic psychologists are gone. That experiment's they'll close it up. That's a failed experiment. The legal system will likely close it up because the forensic psychologists aren't going to put themselves out of a job. That's the problem. So the legal system will stop using forensic custody reports, which is a good thing. It should stop. But then there's no clinical psychologists in the family courts because they haven't worked here 40 years. The clinical psychologists aren't competent with the dark personality, the narcissistic borderline, and the shared delusion and the factitious attachment pathology imposed on another, because they're working in ADHD or autism or depression or eating disorders, or they're not working with the family court pathology. None of them. I'm the only clinical psychologist over here because it's too professionally dangerous to them. That's why I keep highlighting that issue for everybody to understand. You won't get clinical psychologists to work in the family courts as long as you're threatening their license. Plus, they shouldn't right now work in the family courts because they're not competent with this pathology. So they'd have to get competent. How do they get competent? Listen to Dr. Childress, who is and has been working in the family courts. But nobody's listening to me. So nobody out there, the professionals who are incompetent, are turning to a professional who is competent to raise their education level. Now they can go back and read, people like Murray Bowen on family about. They can go back to the actual knowledge. They can read Bowlby on things. The book I recommend that everybody start reading is Ed Tronick's Power of Discord. We always repair a relationship. The worst thing we can possibly do, the ugly, is to leave a relationship unrepaired. But holy cow, that's exactly what these forensic psychologists are often recommending, is that we leave the relationship, the attachment bond between the child and the targeted parent unrepaired, which is the worst possible thing we can do. But that's what they're recommending we do, or you do, because that's the how ignorant and incompetent they are. Let me tell you, if a patient has to explain the pathology to the doctor, that gives you an indication of how low the professional standards of practice are over here. Parents and patients should never, ever, ever have to explain the pathology to the doctor. The doctor should already know. I shouldn't have to explain it to them. They should already know. But that's the current state of the field. The forensic psychologists just drove it down to the bottom, and we have no standards of practice in the family courts regarding professional psychology. And the forensic people sit on the licensing boards. And so they corrupt the licensing board's oversight of what's happening in the family courts. So they need to be gone. They need to be off the licensing boards. We need to get back to only clinical psychologists treating everything. And then we need to get court involved clinical psychologists. And so we're clinical psychologists, but we're court involved, which brings higher standards, but then competence relative to this pathology. But we need to get back to being doctors. Doctors diagnose and treat pathology. We don't make custody recommendations. That's the court's decision. And there's really only three: 50-50 every other weekend, or distance, school year primacy to one, vacation time to the other. That's it. The court can make those determinations. The issue is the pathology that the court's struggling with. We have a child rejecting a parent. Now, when a child rejects a parent, that's severe attachment pathology. And I can talk about that later in other seminars that I do here. But that's a false attachment pathology. But they don't know that because they don't know the attachment system. They wind up believing that that's a real thing when it's not how the brain works. It's not how the attachment system works. But if you have a child rejecting a parent, that's a severe attachment pathology. That's about as bad as attachment pathology gets. Child reject, that's a complete breach in that attachment bond. That's destroying half the child's attachment networks, either the ones for the mother or the ones for the father, the brain is getting messed up big time. They're going to have mother issues or daddy issues one way or the other. And that's child abuse. It's a shared persecutory delusion and a false, factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child. Either one of those diagnoses gets me over to the DSM diagnosis of child psychological abuse. And that's the only thing that causes severe attachment pathology. Less severe than child abuse, and you see a different thing. You don't see a breach in the attachment. You see insecure attachment that more strongly motivates the child to bond to the problematic parent. So insecure, disorganized, insecure, anxious, ambivalent, insecure, avoidant attachment. But you don't see a complete breach in the attachment bond or discord. You don't ever see that coming out of the child. It's a goal corrected motivational system. But if you see that, if you see severe attachment, the only cause is possible abusive range parenting, either by the targeted parent, and that's a two-person attribution of causality, and that's the assertion of the pathological parent, is that the targeted parent is causing the child's attachment pathology towards that parent, so that they're abusive range parent, essentially, and needs a protective response. And that's their kind of vague argument, sometimes even false allegations, but generally it's a vague argument that the targeted parent is somehow abusive of the child, that the child is being malevolently treated in some way by the targeted parent. That's your delusion, persecutory delusion. The concern of the targeted parent is that it's the allied parent who's psychologically abusing the child. That's your shared delusion and their false attachment pathology, a factitious attachment pathology imposed on another. That's the child psychological abuse. So we got an abuse diagnosis on the table one way or the other. So all of these court involved cases that are involving severe attachment pathology around child custody should return a diagnosis of child abuse one way or the other. So I also know for a fact that every case over the last 40 years that has not returned a diagnosis against one parent or the other as being abusive has misdiagnosed the pathology, because that's the only thing that causes the pathology is abuse. And so they say, well, the targeted parent isn't abusive. Well, it must be the other one. Did you diagnose the psychological? No. Well, then you misdiagnosed. You missed the diagnosis of child abuse on one side. Did you assess for a delusional thought disorder? No. Do you know how to assess for delusional? No. Then you shouldn't be working with a delusional thought disorder. Holy Toledo. But they are, and they're not motivated to solve anything. My proof of they're not motivated to solve anything, how many of them are on my Facebook page? How many are listening to these seminars that I'm giving? How many of them are contacting me, by email saying, Dr. Childress, can I set up a consultation with you? A few are, but generally it's at the request of you parents that they're doing this. There's no motivation within professional psychology to even meet the ethical standards. And so that when I get over here and I see how bad things are, we need standards. So I relied on the APA ethics code as a standard of practice that we're going to bring in as just getting a baseline. Once we get the APA ethics code as our baseline standard, then we can improve the quality of mental health services up to the best possible, because that's what the court deserves. That's what these children deserve, the best possible. But currently, we have no standards. We have the worst possible psychologists over here, the worst, and we're giving that to the court system in these massively important decisions that the court has about that are going to affect the child's life. Professional psychology is giving the court the lowest caliber of professional services. That's a problem. APA needs to get over here and improve what they're giving to the courts. We need to get clinical psychologists back. We need to give the courts diagnoses, accurate diagnoses that the courts can rely on. But the APA doesn't care. Why not? Because they refer stuff over to the forensic people, and the forensic people kill it. So the forensic psychologists are infecting the licensing boards, are infecting the APA, and they're housed in the AFCC. That is their professional organization where all these forensic psychologists kind of cluster and generate their false beliefs and their stuff and their supposed credibility because they're the past president of the AFCC or they're involved in the AFCC and all these sorts of things. But it's a viper's pit of ignorance and incompetence over there. So let me tell you about the piggies at the trough of your bank account, and it's stunning to me how the system believes that you're just an inexhaustible source of money for all these people and that solve nothing. They just glom on and take your money, solve absolutely nothing. I'll cite to the last 40 years. We've had these people around the parents, and they've solved nothing for the last 40 years. So they're just taking money and exploiting parents for their money. So let's take a look at who these folks are. Um, so your menagerie of piggies is what I call them. So we'll start with the forensic custody evaluators. I just spoke with them about them. They are absolutely awful. Avoid them at all costs. I'll do a seminar on the Blue Ribbon Commission from New York, Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations. Apparently, there were 20 of these people that looked at it because they voted 11-9 to stop the practice of forensic custody evaluations in the family courts, saying they lacked scientific and professional and legal value. They lack scientific and legal value. I agree with that 100%. They are harmful to children. I agree with that. The defective reports escape meaningful scrutiny. I agree with that. I am the meaningful scrutiny. That's my role in the family courts. So currently, attorneys bring me their custody reports or the reunification therapist reports. There's no such thing, or the various mental health reports, and ask for my second opinion. I apply the knowledge of clinical psychology to the information I review. There's an attorney in the matter who believes that the application of established knowledge from clinical psychology to the information will be helpful to the court in making its decisions. And so the attorney approaches me, gives me the material, the mental health reports and stuff to review, and I provide a second opinion on them from applied knowledge. That's what I do. So I am the meaningful scrutiny in the family courts for these defective reports, quote unquote, that occur in forensic psychology. And what happens is Oregon's licensing board sanctions me for for exposing the forensic psychologist. It wasn't necessarily the Oregon licensing, it was the forensic psychologists who are infecting the Oregon licensing boards, that they wanted to retaliate against me. They extend their jurisdiction into California, just manipulate their laws so they can do that. I was consulting with Dorsey and the Conscious Co-Parenting Institute in California. They massaged their statutes to extend their jurisdiction so they could sanction me specifically because I'm exposing the forensic psychologist. The only use of my CRM report was to file a licensing board complaint against a forensic psychologist. There was no injured party in Oregon. The mother didn't even know that there was a the CRM report, because their case had aged out. There was no use of my report in the family courts. So the mother didn't care. The father wanted the report to file a licensing board complaint against the involved forensic psychologist, who just refused to assess for possible child abuse. Dad says, "Would you please assess for possible psychological abuse?" The forensic psychologist said no. So that fear infuriated the dad. He goes and gets this research analysis out of Dorsey and the custody resolution method, files a board complaint against the forensic psychologist saying, "See, the data says you should have conducted an assessment for possible child abuse." And the licensing board in Oregon sanctions me because I exposed the forensic psychologist. The only injured party in Oregon was the forensic psychologist who refused to do a risk assessment. And the Oregon licensing board is protecting the forensic psychologist. They're not protecting the consumer from unethical practice. No, 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 no. Licensing boards understand this. Licensing boards are not protecting the consumer from unethical professional practices. They are protecting the unethical and incompetent forensic psychologists from accountability by the consumer. So they're screwing the consumer. They don't care about the consumer. They're protecting the forensic psychologists. That's what the forensic psychologists on the licensing boards are doing. They're covering up, and that's exposed. And if you pull the string, you'll find that that's true. Um, Everything I'm saying is true and correct because it has to be. This is a pathology of lies. I know that. So I'm documenting everything and getting my support and making true statements. So the forensic psychologist and forensic custody evaluations are absolutely awful. $20 to $40,000, 6 to 9 months. Don't return a diagnosis. You still need an assessment after these forensic reports to get a diagnosis of whether there's a shared delusion and child abuse in this situation, which parent. So they're pointless. They're absolutely pointless, which is why we got this recent report. I got 3 forensic custody evaluations, and it still solved nothing. Everybody's still fighting about the stuff, and they call in Dr. Childress, and you have to pay me additional money to make sense of the situation. So it's a nightmare. So do not use forensic custody evaluations. That needs to die. So it needs to die by supply and demand. The demand just needs to dry up entirely, and then people like the Blue Ribbon Commission and the state legislatures and everybody just needs to ban the practice of forensic custody evaluations in the family courts. APA should be doing that. The AFCC should be improving the quality of theirs, but none of the professionals are taking responsibility for what happens in the family courts. So that's your first group. So don't use them. They're a waste of money. Get over to a clinical diagnostic assessment. Good luck finding one because no clinical psychologists work in the family courts. So then the second group that are piggies at your trough are the child individual therapists. They are also a nightmare. They are the most actively child abusers in the family courts. I haven't spoken much about them. I've been hammering the forensic custody evaluators, waiting to get to this point. But once I'm in the family courts, waiting and working in the family courts, I'm looking at the individual therapists as being child abusers. Because if you believe the shared delusion, you become part of the shared delusion. When that delusion is child abuse, you become part of the child abuse. And so all the individual therapists are believing the shared delusion. I pretty much guarantee it. They did not conduct a proper assessment of the family. They just get the child in. The child says, "Oh, this other parent is so mean to me." And they say, "Oh, you poor child." They believe the delusion. So instead of what they're doing is they think what they're doing is validating the child's feelings, and it's a humanistic existential approach that somehow by validating the child's feelings, the child will grow and develop. That's a humanistic model. It doesn't really work in general practice, but it certainly doesn't work with a delusional thought disorder. The treatment for a delusion is never to validate it. That's insane. The person has a fixed and false belief, and you're telling them that that belief is true, that you're responding as if their false belief is true. You communicate to that child that there is substance and validity to their false belief. So they are participants in the shared delusion, and they are participants in, therefore, the psychological abuse of the child. So, all individual therapists, if you've got an individual therapist, I pretty much guarantee they are helping the allied parent abuse the child and create the pathology in the child by giving their professional um, recognition and standing to the truth of the child's false belief. So, they all deserve to lose their license for failing to conduct a proper assessment of possible child abuse. In all cases of severe attachment pathology in the courts, it's possible child abuse. We need to get a proper assessment of that. Did they do that? No. Why not? Because they don't know what the pathology is. They're incompetent, standard 2.01, 2.04, and they failed to conduct a proper assessment. Because of that, they've misdiagnosed delusional thought disorder, and they're participating in the psychological abuse of the child. So now you got potentially, if you got 2 children, you got 2 individual therapists and who are just taking your money and actually contributing to the pathology. Yikes, that's really, really bad. A mental health person should never, ever be a child abuser, but I guarantee you all of these individual child therapists are child abusers. So they need all of them need to lose their license for being a child abuser. Now, that we should not have a child abuser being a therapist for a child. No, 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 no. So all of them need to lose their license for being child abusers and for being negligent and lazy and incompetent and failing in just their professional obligations to be competent, to know what they're doing. So now you're paying for a couple of individual therapists who are creating the child abuse. Reunification therapists, that's just the forensic evaluators in a different role. So what they do is they do forensic evaluations. But what happens if they don't do a forensic evaluation? Well, then they become the reunification therapist for the other forensic psychologist who did the custody evaluation. So forensic psychologist A says we need a reunification therapy. There's no such thing. They just make stuff up over here. There's no such thing as reunification. There's family systems, internal family systems therapy, emotionally focused therapy, dialectic behavior therapy, solution focused therapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy. There's a lot of psychotherapies that are defined. There's nothing defined called reunification therapy that only occurs in the family courts as a made up thing. So anything that only occurs in the family courts is not a real thing. If it's not occurring out in the general public as well, then it's just a made up thing that they're doing in the family courts. So parental alienation, resist refuse dynamic, and reunification therapy are all made up things as part of this experiment they were doing on you. You were guinea pigs for them, and they destroyed your life in the process. So the reunification therapist, there's no such thing. They're just taking your money. It has not solved their forensic psychology's reunification therapists have not solved anything in 40 years, not for a single family out there. So yeah, they're just taking your money as well. And it's basically they'll take your money for about 18 months to 2 years of failed therapy, and then they'll say, "Oh, you run out of money," or "Oh, I don't know what to do. So let's get another forensic evaluation because 2 years in because we failed on your reunification therapy." They are just taking your money. And the moment your money runs out, they say, "Oh, you can't afford therapy anymore," and so you're kind of on your own with however bad we've left your situation. Guardians ad litem. That's another one. Absolutely unnecessary because we actually have a capable guardian. And the guardian is the healthy targeted parent. The healthy normal range targeted parent is a fully capable and competent parent and guardian for the child. We don't need another guardian in the situation. The problem with the guardians ad litem is the treatment for cancer is different than the treatment for diabetes. So are these guardians getting an accurate diagnosis of what the pathology is? We got one parent or the other abusing the child. Is the guardian ad litem making decisions to protect the child from one or the other abusive parent? How have they decided that the parent is abused? We need to get a proper risk assessment. And so it would be the role of the guardian to make sure that a proper risk assessment gets conducted. Now, the guardian parent, who is actually the legal guardian for the child, would fulfill that role. The targeted parent, who is the healthy parent, who is not creating the pathology, is an appropriate guardian and is seeking to get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse over the objections and ignorance of the mental health people. If we have an actual guardian ad litem on the case, that should be their responsibility then, as a guardian for the child, to ensure that we get an accurate diagnosis and effective treatment for the most severe attachment pathology possible in their client. But are they doing that? No, I don't know what they're doing. And so they are just a drain on your resources. Typically, they get in there and mess with stuff. Oftentimes, they believe the shared delusion, so they become part of the child abuse of the allied parent. So we got guardians ad litem because of their ignorance. They're not doing a diagnosis. They're not mental health people. And so they just sign up for a list to become a guardian. and then believe the shared delusion and become part of the child abuse, part of the spousal abuse. That's the other one, part of the spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon. So the guardians ad litem become part of the spousal abuse. The forensic psychologists become part of the spousal abuse. The individual therapist becomes part of the spousal abuse. And the issue in the family courts, so you can file licensing board complaints, and I recommend that people do. That's my obligation to you, is to tell you these you're getting uh, very poor services that are likely in violation of ethical standards, and that your appropriate response for you parents is to file a licensing board complaint against the involved professional. Plus, just your moral obligation as part of the pathology here, as the victim of the pathology, is to make sure that these incompetent and abusive mental health people don't remain in the family courts. And so if you leave them unaffected by, and you escape, but you don't file the licensing board complaint, then you leave them for the next family. They're just going to do it to the next family. And so there's an obligation amongst all of you to make sure that you hold the mental health people accountable to what you deserve. You don't have to prove anything to a parent, to the court, or to anybody, or to the doctor. You deserve high quality professional standards of practice. You deserve an accurate diagnosis from the mental health people. That's just basic health care. You deserve a proper risk assessment and an accurate diagnosis returned. But they're not doing that. Like in Oregon, the forensic person says, no, I'm not conducting a risk assessment. So you're kind of screwed because they're not doing their job. And that's what needs to happen, is the doctors need to do their job. We need to diagnose what the pathology is and give the court that information, so the court has accurate information on which they can rely for the court's decision. So there's your guardians ad litem. There we have a guardian. We don't need another one. Now here's an interesting one: the parenting coordinators. That role does not exist anywhere else in professional psychology. It exists only in the family courts. Anything that exists only in the family courts is a made up thing. And so, because the forensic experiment in these forensic psychologists was a complete failure, these forensic psychologists have no idea what to do. They came up with this new role for the family courts of a decision maker, because they say the parents can't make the decision. Well, no, we have one parent who is absolutely capable of making that decision. That's a targeted parent who's healthy. They can make decisions about their child just fine. But it's the pathological parent who's messing things up. We don't need a decision maker. We need a diagnosis and an effective treatment plan. But because we're not getting a diagnosis or treatment plan, they impose this decision maker on the families. Now, I have serious, serious problems with this role of a parenting coordinator as a decision maker, because the parents have not been legally, parental rights of the parents have not been removed. There's been no legal finding that the targeted parent is somehow an incompetent parent and is not capable of making decisions about their child, and yet the decision making of that parent has been overturned and overruled by this parenting coordinator. That to me is a violation of informed consent out of the Belmont report. The Belmont report was produced after World War II about the Nazi medical experiments, that we don't take people's rights away from them regarding their treatment, or the treatment of their child, without due process. We just don't walk in and say, you don't have any rights to decide what happens to you or your child. Somebody is going to be imposed on you for arbitrary reasons, who's going to make decisions about you and your child. That's a real problem to me regarding people's rights to self-determination, the parents' rights and the parents' rights to make decisions about their child. So that to me is an extraordinarily problematic role, that was created only within the family courts. You don't find parenting coordinators with ADHD or autism or eating disorders or substance abuse or depression or anxiety or anything else. We don't need parenting coordinators with any other pathology, including attachment pathology that's not court involved. We don't need parenting coordinators for any other pathology except in this family courts, because of the failure of the forensic psychologists, they have to create a new role who becomes another piggy at your trough, taking your money and solving nothing. Final thing on the parenting coordinators, the recommendations for cancer are different than the recommendations for diabetes. The decisions you make around cancer will be different than the decisions you make around diabetes. Diabetes, you're checking your insulin and you're giving yourself a shot if you need it. For cancer, you're doing chemotherapy or doing some sort of surgery or something to treat the. Those are totally different types of decisions you're making. So I would ask all parenting coordinators, are you making a decision for child abuse by the targeted parent or child abuse by the allied parent? Because that's the only thing that's causing the pathology is possible child abuse. So which parent is abusive and what are you doing about that? Now, when we have child abuse, for a fact, the only question is which parent. That means for all decisions coming out of the court and mental health people, we need to protect the child. The only question is from which parent. So if that decision is not one of protecting the child from one parent or the other, when you have court involved custody and a severe attachment pathology, you've misdiagnosed the pathology. That's a fact. And so, if one parent or the other is abusing the child, you have not returned a diagnosis as to which parent, then you're leaving the child half the time or whatever the time, 80% of the time, sometimes 100% of the time, sometimes with the abusive parent. That's a fact. So, if you're not returning a diagnosis, that child's being left with an abusive parent. Fact. And I can guarantee you, I've worked child abuse, all four types, and led the treatment teams for all four types. I can guarantee you that no treatment of mine for a child being beaten with electrical cords is going to work as long as I send the kid home to be beaten with electrical cords. No therapy of mine for child sex abuse by the stepdad or something. No therapy for sex abuse by the stepdad is going to be effective when I'm sending the child home to be sexually abused by the stepdad. The first thing we do with child abuse is protect the child. Always, 100% of the time. And so if I have a child abuse diagnosis and I'm not getting a child protection response one way or the other, I know they've misdiagnosed the pathology and I know that the child abuse is continuing. And that's why the reunification therapy is not working because you got an actively abused child and active spousal abuse. Going back to the licensing boards for a second, there's a second level, which is the malpractice lawsuits. And the malpractice lawsuits is for the negligent failure in their duty to protect obligations. That's going to put it into terrace off range. I'll talk about that maybe some other time. But it's the malpractice lawsuits um, that are also relevant in this situation. And so the parents need to be not only filing the licensing board complaints, but we need to get some malpractice lawsuits up here for negligent incompetence, negligent failure in their duty to protect obligations over here. And the parenting coordinator, did you conduct a proper risk assessment? No, that's not my role. Well, then how do you know whether you're making recommendations or decisions for cancer or diabetes? So it's a nightmare over here. But again, piggy at your trough, they'll take your money, they'll impose decisions on you. You'll have to fight against those decisions because you actually care about your child. You're trying to get your child proper care as a guardian for your child, as a parent for your child, and you have this stray person put in there to interfere with you and interfere with what you want to accomplish and to continue the psychological abuse of the child. So I would suggest that the parenting coordinators are participating in the child abuse because of their absence of diagnosis, accurate diagnosis. Diagnosis means the same thing as identify. Pathology means the same thing as problem. We must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. So the parenting coordinator needs to first identify what the problem is with the parenting decisions in order to be able to fix them and make appropriate decisions. So the parenting coordinators first diagnose what the problem, what the pathology is before they know how to make decisions about how to fix it. Are they identifying no? They are missing the diagnosis, identification of a shared persecutory delusion and factitious disorder, and they're missing the diagnosis of child psychological abuse. As a result, they are participating and colluding in the psychological child abuse of the child, the child because they're not competent, because it's a weird role. They didn't conduct a proper assessment because that's not their role, and it's just a nightmare. So, final one, Piggy at your trough, is minors counsel. You appoint an attorney for the child to represent the child's voice to the court. Well, the child's voice is compromised by the psychological control of an allied parent, cross generational coalition. So you're essentially, the minors counsel is supporting the voice of the pathological parent that's being expressed by the child. So you've essentially appointed an attorney to represent the pathology. Well, if you're going to appoint an attorney to represent the pathology, then you should appoint an attorney to represent the treatment. But now we've got four attorneys. We got an attorney for the targeted parent, an attorney for the allied parent, an attorney representing the pathology, the minors counsel, and an attorney representing treatment, to balance the minors counsel representation of the pathology. Insane. Insane. No, four attorneys for like one family. Piggies at the trough, just taking your money, taking your money. So no, you don't need a minors counsel. In fact, don't get one. They are just the awful. If you have a minors counsel, if you're consulting with me and you say, I have a minors counsel, my estimate of your ability to solve the situation goes to pretty much zero. That minors counsel will make sure that the child abuse continues. That's their job, is to make sure that the child abuse of the allied parent continues, because they're representing the child's distorted voice. They are representing the false attachment pathology. And that's, Your Honor, the child doesn't want to be with the pathological parent, so we shouldn't, make the child become healthy, and we should just leave the child's pathology entirely untreated, and unresolved. The worst possible thing we can do, minors counsel, is to leave your client's pathology, attachment pathology, untreated and unresolved. That's the worst thing that can happen to your client, minors counsel, and that's what you're arguing to the court for. You are arguing to the court that the court leave the child with an abusive parent, minors counsel. You are representing the child abuse, minors counsel, of your client, minors counsel. So minors counsel really needs to take a look at that, and the legal profession really needs to take a look at that. The proper role that everybody's looking for with the guardian ad litem, parenting coordinators, minors counsel, is an amicus attorney who represents the interests of the court in the child's effective treatment. We don't need somebody representing the child. We need somebody representing the court's legitimate interest in making sure that this child gets effective treatment. So that amicus attorney should be working with the dialectic family therapist to come up with a treatment plan. And you have things like the contingent visitation schedule and various other approaches we could use, that where the amicus attorney for the court and the family therapist working with the family can work together to make sure the court gets accurate information about what the pathology is, what the problem is, and what its treatment is, how to fix it. And we need to fix severe attachment pathology within 3 to 6 months. Done. 3 to 6 months. I don't want to see attachment pathology lasting beyond 6 months, because it's devastating to the attachment networks. It's devastating to the child's healthy development. So we need to end the fighting around these children, and we need to get back to established professional standards of practice ethically. We need to start making accurate diagnoses so that we can fix the problem. The reason it's taking more than 3 to 6 months to fix the attachment pathology in the family courts is because you are misdiagnosing the pathology. There's only two reasons for failed treatment. Either A, you've misdiagnosed the pathology and you're treating cancer with insulin, or B, you've accurately diagnosed the pathology, but you're incompetent in the delivery of the intervention for that diagnosis. because if you've accurately diagnosed the pathology and you're competent in its treatment, then you're going to fix it. So if you're not fixed within 3 months, and would expect to see on any effective treatment plan, I'd like to see progress at about 6 weeks, definite progress at 6 weeks. So I don't care what it is, I want to be seeing progress on the depression, anxiety, eating disorder, whatever it is, on 6 weeks. Now, not solution on it necessarily, depending on the pathology, but even autism. I want to see something happening. If I've got 6 weeks of treatment in there, I want to see something happening with the outcome measures. Every therapy should have outcome measures. How do you know if it's effective? How do you know monitoring stuff? How do you know when you've reached your goals if you're not collecting outcome measures? That's just so basic in therapy. In clinical psychology, at least, you won't see a single one outcome measure over in forensic psychology or in the family courts. So we need to get back over to established professional knowledge, get clinical psychology back, elevate the standards in the family courts so that we can fix the pathology, elevate the standards to ethical standards, APA. So we need to elevate the standards of practice in the family courts to basic ethics. Just comply with the APA ethics code, elevation. Then we can elevate that into actual superior professional services in the family courts. But first, we got to just get the basic ethical standards. Geez Louise, these people, their ethics code is mandatory, it's required, and these people are not doing that. Where are the licensing boards? Nowhere to be seen, because they're being corrupted by the influence of the forensic psychologist on all 50 state licensing boards. So you're kind of stuck out there as parents. You're going to find that you have a bunch of people taking your money. None of these are effective. None of these will solve things. They're just going to take your money till it's gone, and then they're going to abandon you. So you need to get an accurate diagnosis so that you're able to protect your child. I understand that you're a capable parent. You don't need people coming in and telling you what to do. You need support in protecting your child, because I know you want to protect your child, and you're a capable guardian. You're a normal, healthy range parent. So the mental health people should be supporting you in that capacity of protecting the child. And because the mental health people have duty to protect obligations, we should be independently making sure that you, as a parent, are not being spousally abused by the pathological parent using the child as a weapon. So we have duty to protect obligations to the child. That it makes me insane that they are not stepping up to those responsibilities. They're negligent in their duty to care, duty to protect the child, and it just, because of their incompetence, laziness, unethical practice, they just simply don't care. Their apathy. So they fail to conduct a proper assessment. And they misdiagnose the pathology. They don't care, and they don't care about the child abuse. They don't take any steps to protect the child. But, and they are also participating in the spousal abuse of you parents. This is a brutal spousal abuse, taking your child away from you and creating all the pathology in your child, and the rejection and the grief and all that stuff, and the stress, and that's spousal abuse. That's psychological spousal abuse of you by your ex-spouse using the child as a weapon, and the mental health people aren't protecting you from that. That's participating in the spousal abuse, and that's where I suspect there might be damages on this. That the licensing board's complaints don't get damages, but malpractice could get damages. The question is, how do you monetize the damages from misdiagnosed child abuse and misdiagnosed spousal abuse? Spousal abuse is probably just going to be on the pain and suffering kind of side. Just damn, they just devastated you. If you go into if you go in for a normal spousal abuse kind of situation, normal, where the mom's being beaten and physical abuse by the abusive parent, and you go in to the mental health person, and the mental health person sides with the physically abusive spousal abuser on this, that's like really bad. They're not protecting the spouse, and they're siding with the spousal. They become part of the spousal abuse. So they deserve to lose their license for one, but potentially you might have damages on that, pain and suffering kind of stuff. But it's how do you monetize the impact on the child of allowing the child abuse for years? So you've massively changed. The child was headed on one potential course in life if they have a normal childhood, but you've left them with an abusive parent. So now they've got mommy or daddy issues for the next 40 years, and you've totally destroyed their life. You've totally destroyed their next marriage and their family and stuff because you've failed to fix the relationship in childhood, so you've just let it go into adulthood and change the course of their life. How do you monetize leaving a child in a child abusive situation? I don't know. I think there's potentially malpractice suits by the child of alienation once they reach adulthood. When the child of alienation realizes, holy cow, I was abused by the targeted parent and nobody protected me, I look into a malpractice lawsuit against the involved mental health people for failing to protect you as a child. They were listening to your manipulated voice. Well, that's a problem. They shouldn't have. They should have protected you from the abuse so that you could have a normal range childhood, so they could end the family conflict around you. It didn't go on for 6 or 7 years or however long it went on for. They should have solved it, the family pathology, within 3 to 6 months, so that you could have an affectionate bond to both parents and a normal range childhood was just doing normal range stuff instead of all this stress you went through and all this other stuff because of their ignorance and incompetence and unethical malpractice. So I think there's malpractice lawsuits from the child victim once they reach majority. I think there's malpractice lawsuits from the parents regarding the child and add in your own spousal abuse. I think there's ethical board complaints for violations of ethical standards, and none of that, or at least the licensing board complaints, are being addressed by the licensing boards. They're participating in it. The malpractice lawsuits is simply because that adds another financial expense to you. And when you got so many piggies feeding into your bank account, you don't have the money. We close with this. With this. All the money that is spent surrounding this child, even for the legitimate therapy, but all the money that is being spent around this child needs to be going to the child's college education fund. Okay. All these people who are parasites on you and your bank account are drawing their money to pay for their kids' college and to pay for their car payments and house payments. They are taking that money from you and your child. So your child won't have the college money because the parenting coordinator took your money, because the GAL took your money, because that needs to stop. What we need to do is get clinical psychologists back, and we need to bring the costs of this pathology way, way down. Start to finish, it should not run over $10,000 for anything. Anything. We can probably bring it in for around 5,000, maybe even less, if we get it systematized going forward. Um, where we understand we're looking at what's coming in. We know what's coming in, so prepare for it and do it. We could get that down to relatively efficient, and we can do early interventions on it. We can do all sorts of stuff, but it needs the motivation, and no one's motivated. Want proof no one's motivated? How many mental health people are showing up on my Facebook page asking me questions? Nope, zero. Why do you think I'm on my Facebook page? I'm educating you parents, but it's also the parakeet in the coal mine. Is Dr. Bernay over here? Amy Baker? No, no. The Gardnerians never showed up on any Facebook page, any blog, any kind of interaction with me. So now what about the forensic psychologists? Are they showing up over here? Are they asking me questions on Facebook, or I'm available? Are they reaching out to me individually? You won't know if they reach out to me individually. So that's not a good documentation. Me being on Facebook and giving these seminars, like the one on ethics I gave a while ago on the fireside chats, those are available to the mental health people. And so the fact that they're not seeking additional consult from somebody who is competent in all these pathologies indicates the current status. The moment they start looking to me, that indicates that we have now shifted into a focus on being competent. So with that, I'm going to go recover from Saturday night and start in with my next round of reviews of forensic custody evaluations. Boy, those are bad. So with that, um, good luck, everybody, and take care, and best to your kids. All right, so let's turn this off. All right, take care, everybody.